When the royal banners flew high and the bells of the great hall chimed, the people believed all was well. The king had been sick, yes, but the palace assured everyone His Majesty was recovering. Daily proclamations spoke of his steady improvement, even though no one had seen him in weeks. The royal seals still stamped decrees. Orders still came from his chamber. Foreign envoys were still turned away politely on doctor's orders. But behind the thick velvet curtains of the throne room, a dangerous truth was being buried. The king was already dead. Not poisoned, not assassinated in public. He had quietly died in his bed after weeks of illness, surrounded not by his people or court, but by only a few trusted men who made a decision that would change history. They didn't announce the death. Instead, they locked the doors of the royal chambers, dismissed all but the most loyal servants, and burned any records of the night he passed. A handful of guards were sworn to silence under threat of death. The official story: the king is resting and recovering. But what followed wasn't just a cover-up. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy to rule in his name, without the people ever knowing. But why? Because the heir was missing. The crown prince had vanished weeks earlier during a rebellion in the northern territories. Whether dead, captured, or in hiding, no one knew. If the king's death became public, the throne would be empty. The kingdom would fracture overnight. Rival houses would rise. Foreign powers would invade. Civil war would be inevitable. So the truth was hidden. Not just from the people, but even from many inside the palace. In the dark corridors of the palace, orders came from behind closed doors bearing the king's name. But the signature was forged. The voice of the crown was now that of the chancellor, a brilliant strategist, loyal to the kingdom, or so it seemed. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But inside the royal court, servants whispered. Meals were left untouched. No footsteps echoed from the king's private quarters. Some claimed they had seen his body pale and lifeless, secretly carried through the servant tunnels. Others said he was still alive but mad, locked away in shame. The truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. And yet, one chambermaid, young and unnoticed, had seen something she shouldn't have, something she could not forget, and what she knew could destroy the entire lie. If she lived long enough to tell anyone, the kingdom moved forward. Trade continued. Taxes were collected. Soldiers were deployed, all under the illusion that the king remained alive. But inside the palace, the truth had grown legs. It no longer sat still in the king's chamber. It walked the halls in royal robes. It signed orders with the king's name. And most disturbingly, it wore the king's ring. The royal signet, a thick golden band with a lion engraved beneath a crown, was supposed to stay on the king's hand until death. It was a symbol of absolute power. But now it rested on another man's finger, Lord Chancellor Marin. Marin had served the crown for over 2 decades. Wise, eloquent, and unshakably calm, he had always stood behind the throne, whispering advice into the king's ear. But now he stood in front of it, issuing decrees with unnerving confidence. He claimed everything was in the king's name. But no one had seen the king sign anything. No one had even heard his voice in weeks. And Marin never allowed anyone close enough to ask. Those who questioned the king's health were sent away, sometimes to remote garrisons, sometimes to dungeons, and some were never seen again. One of those who did question was a court scribe named Edric. He noticed that every royal decree bore the exact same signature, no variation, no smudges, not even a hurried line. It was too perfect. Edric raised his concern in a private letter to another scribe. The next morning, both men were gone. The letter was found in the fire, half burned. Still, whispers spread. Among them was a young chambermaid named Thalia, the same girl who had seen something terrifying a few weeks earlier. She had been delivering linens to the royal quarters late one night when she saw 2 guards roll out a covered body on a stretcher. One side of the sheet had slipped. She swore she saw the king's face, pale, lifeless eyes open in an empty stare. No one believed her, or if they did, they dared not say so. Adelia noticed something else too. A day later, the chancellor appeared wearing the king's ring. It was too large for his finger. It slid and twisted whenever he moved his hand. Why would Marin wear it at all, unless he wanted people to see it, to believe it was passed to him as a sign of trust, or worse, as proof of his control? Behind closed doors, Marin had begun to summon nobles, but not to seek their counsel, to issue warnings. One by one, those loyal to the crown were either won over with promises or silenced. The court was no longer a council. It was a trap. And then a secret letter was smuggled out of the palace, addressed to a name not spoken in months: the Lost Prince. The letter was written in hurried ink, the parchment slightly torn, as if ripped from a hidden notebook. It read, "The king is dead. Marin wears his ring. The court is poisoned with fear. If you still breathe, come home. You are the last hope." It bore no signature, only a symbol: a hawk with wings folded, identical to the prince's childhood seal. That message, smuggled by a kitchen boy through a secret tunnel beneath the palace, began a desperate whisper through the kingdom. A question no one dared ask aloud for years now had a second life. Where is Prince Ulrich? Ulrich had vanished 3 years earlier, after a public fallout with his father. The official record said he had been exiled for insubordination. Rumors said he was imprisoned. Others believed he had died in battle while fighting under a false name. But no body was ever returned. No grave marked his name. No one truly knew what happened, except maybe one person, an old knight named Sir Joran, once the prince's personal guard. He had left court the same day the prince did. Some said he'd grown disillusioned. Others said he followed the prince into exile. He lived on the edge of the kingdom in a weathered cottage, rarely seen and never speaking of the past, till the boy arrived with the letter. Joran read it in silence. Then he folded the note, tucked it into his chest plate, and walked into the woods. What happened next was never recorded. But 2 days later, a traveler heading through the northern border claimed to have seen a cloaked figure on horseback, carrying a banner no one had seen in years, silver with a lone hawk. If true, it meant one thing: Prince Ulrich still lived, and he was riding home. But Marin wasn't blind. He'd spent years preparing for this day. In fact, many believed he had driven the prince away on purpose, isolating the one man who could challenge him. Now that the kingdom believed the king was alive, any return of the prince would be branded a rebellion, a treasonous act. Still deep within the court, some nobles began to shift. Secret glances. Coded words. The chancellor may have controlled the palace, but outside its walls, loyalties were fragile. And as whispers of the prince's return reached the city's edge, something began to stir in the people. A new rumor spread, dangerous, unconfirmed, and impossible to ignore. The prince has proof that the king was murdered. But if that were true, then who helped Marin hide the body? The king's death, it turns out, did not happen in bed. It didn't happen in peace, and it didn't happen alone. According to the court's official story, King Elric III passed away in his sleep from a long-standing illness. No autopsy was done. The body was said to be too fragile for viewing. And within a single day, the palace issued a public notice that he had retired from duties for spiritual reflection. It's an absurd phrase that historians would later mark as the moment truth died in the kingdom. But now, hidden testimonies from former servants and records buried beneath forged seals suggest something far darker. One maid, who vanished weeks after the king's retirement, had reportedly told her sister that she'd found blood in the king's chamber. Not illness, blood. The bedsheets were removed, the rugs burned, and no healer was ever summoned. More disturbingly, the royal physician, a man named Tybalt, was last seen entering the king's chambers just after midnight on the day of the death. He never left. Guards claimed he took a ship south the next morning, but no port records exist. No departure logs. No witness ever saw him again. And the most damning clue is the royal seal. The seal used to declare royal edicts was locked in a vault beside the king's bed. Only he had the key. Yet days after his disappearance, new orders were signed with it. Orders that handed power of the court to Chancellor Marone. How did he access it? The vault showed no signs of forced entry. But one chamberlain recalled that Marin was drenched in sweat. The morning after the king vanished, and holding something wrapped in cloth, at the same time, all portraits of Prince Ulrich were removed from the palace, his rooms sealed, his name banned in official gatherings. Anyone who spoke of his return was dismissed or disappeared. In one chilling twist, a stable boy later claimed to see 2 palace guards wheeling a large, covered cart out of the royal garden in the dead of night. He He said it smelled like old metal and herbs. It's like death masked in perfume. The route taken that night led to the royal tombs. But the king's crypt remained empty. So where was the body? And more importantly, if Marin orchestrated this cover-up, who helped him? Because no one could silence a king, not without the help of someone inside the royal family. And that points to a possibility no one dared voice aloud. Had the queen herself betrayed the king? She wore black far too soon, and she didn't cry, not once. Queen Eleonora's behavior in the weeks following the king's retirement was described as calm. To calm. According to court staff, she moved through the halls with quiet purpose, avoiding the royal chapel, never asking after her husband, and never challenging the chancellor's decisions, even when they overrode her own. But the deeper you dig into the palace records, the stranger it gets. For instance, Queen Eleonora suddenly started attending meetings with Marin, private ones, without witnesses or counsel. Their alliance shocked many in court. Before the king's disappearance, Eleonora and Marin had clashed repeatedly over foreign policy, inheritance rights, and control of the military. Yet suddenly, they were in lockstep. There was even a note found in the royal archive. Unsigned, half-burned, believed to be from Eleonora herself. It read, "The realm must not see its heart bleed. Let history forget the scream that crowned a silence." What did she mean by scream? Was it metaphor? Or did she hear something the night the king died? Even stranger, the queen's personal guard, once led by loyalists to the king, was quietly replaced. Some were sent on mission and never returned. Others were imprisoned for conspiring with outside forces. None were ever tried. And then there's the portrait. One of the palace's oldest painters, Master Helric, was commissioned to create a new official portrait of the queen just weeks after the king vanished. According to his son, who recorded his father's journals, Helric was disturbed by the request. He wrote, "Her eyes are not grieving, they are guarding, as if something inside her must not escape." But perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is what Eleonora didn't do. She didn't announce her husband's death. She didn't summon the court to mourn. She didn't even send word to the king's brother, who was next in line to the throne. Instead, she signed a new declaration, one that made Marin the protector of the realm, till a future heir was declared ready, a title that had not existed before, and gave Marin near total control. Why would she do that? Some believe she was coerced, that Marin held evidence against her, perhaps implicating her in the king's death. Others believe it was a pact. Protect her son's claim in exchange for silence. But the more haunting theory is this, that the queen believed the realm could not survive knowing the truth. That she feared something darker than betrayal. It's something about the king's final moments, and the secret now buried with him. Because what if it wasn't Marin who orchestrated everything? What if it was her? For years, the people believed the young Prince Thalin was away at sea, learning the ways of diplomacy and foreign courts. That's what the royal scribes were ordered to write. It's what the queen's envoys told the nobles. But here's the chilling truth. Prince Thalin never left the castle. In fact, his name vanishes from palace records only days after his father's alleged departure. No letters, no sightings, no formal travel orders, and worst of all, no goodbye from his own mother. A single witness, a chambermaid named Lyra, dared to speak years later under the protection of exile. In her account, she saw the prince escorted into the king's private chamber late one stormy night. He was crying. He carried something small in his hand. She described it as a wooden carving, something he made for his father. He never came out again. The next morning, that entire wing of the palace was closed for repairs. Guards were stationed at every corridor, and then silence. So what happened to the rightful heir? There are several dark theories. Some believe the prince was poisoned, and the queen allowed it, perhaps even ordered it to prevent a power struggle. Others claim the prince was taken and hidden away by loyalists, in fear that Marin would kill him. But there's another, even darker possibility. What if Prince Thalin saw something? Something that could unravel the entire illusion Marin and Eleonora were constructing. Maybe he walked in on his father's death. Maybe he heard what truly happened behind that heavy chamber door. Maybe his loyalty to truth made him a liability. One damning clue rests in a forgotten crypt beneath the palace chapel. Among the tombs of minor royals lies a small, unmarked grave. Its stone was removed, the soil disturbed. Monks tasked with maintaining the site whispered of a small body once laid there, the wooden carving in its hands. But why the secrecy? Why bury a royal heir without name or ceremony? Because a burial would force acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would demand accountability. If the realm knew the king was dead and his son mysteriously vanished, Marin's rule would collapse overnight. Civil war would be inevitable. So they chose the lie. A prince abroad, king retired, a queen grieving, and the bloodline erased. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. A letter found in a northern monastery bore the prince's childhood signature, dated years after his disappearance. Some claim it's a forgery. Others believe he survived and waited for justice. Because if Prince Thalin lived, who was he waiting for? Years passed. The kingdom settled under Marin's rule. Official histories praised his leadership, the queen's wisdom, and the peace that had been restored. But the silence came at a cost. Whispers still circled about a vanished prince and a secret death. Then, on a cold winter's night, something happened that shook the palace guards to their core. A lone traveler appeared at the eastern gate of the royal fortress. Cloaked in furs, face weathered, eyes cold with quiet fire. He didn't demand entrance. He didn't speak of war. He simply handed a sealed parchment to the captain of the watch and showed him a ring. Not just any ring. It bore the crest of King Emmerich's bloodline, a golden stag wrapped in ivy, known only to the royal family and their most trusted circle. It had been presumed lost, along with Prince Thalin. The guard's hands shook as he took it. He asked no questions. The man disappeared into the fog before a second word could be spoken. That night, no one slept in the barracks. The captain broke protocol and delivered the letter directly to Queen Eleonora, bypassing Marin entirely. Within the hour, the queen's chambers were sealed. Maids and scribes were dismissed. Lamps burned long past midnight. No word left the room. But something had changed. The next morning, Marin did not appear for counsel. The queen, pale and cold-eyed, announced he was unwell. Over the next week, 3 of the oldest advisors were quietly dismissed. 2 guards from the king's private wing were found reassigned to the borders, and the captain who received the letter, he was gone. No funeral, no retirement decree, just gone. People began to wonder, was it the prince? Had he returned, not to fight, but to remind the crown that truth can't be buried forever? One monk claimed the traveler visited the monastery days later. He said the man asked only one question: does justice still breathe within these walls? But when the monk tried to speak more, he was silenced by royal decree. Still, that one phrase spread like wildfire among the people. Graffiti appeared on walls, etched in stone, scribbled on parchments. Justice still breathes. The kingdom was restless again. Not with violence, but with memory. With ghosts. With the quiet possibility that someone had survived and was watching, but who had sent the traveler? And why did Queen Eleonora weep at dawn the next morning, in the same chapel where the unmarked grave lay? The truth wasn't just returning. It was demanding to be seen. The queen's face had grown gaunt. Her once commanding voice now trembled behind palace doors. She no longer attended court. No festivals, no speeches. Something within her had cracked, and it wasn't grief alone. Behind the veil of royal grace, Eleonora was fighting her own secret war, one that no one could see. Late one night, in the forgotten wing of the palace, a maid stumbled upon something strange. The queen, alone in the archives, lit only by candlelight, clutching a worn, leather-bound book. She was crying. That book was King Emmerich's personal journal. The queen's sea chamberlain later revealed what no one dared speak aloud. Eleonora had hidden the journal after Emmerich's death, not out of loyalty, but guilt. Inside were notes from the king's final weeks, cryptic entries, observations, doubts, a single phrase repeated over and over again in growing panic. Marin is not what he seems. The queen cannot see it yet, but he's already circling the throne. If I fall, it will not be from illness. It will be betrayal. Eleonora hadn't believed it then. Blinded by grief, surrounded by Marin's reassurances, she'd let herself believe the king's sickness had been natural, not inflicted. But the entries were too precise, too detailed. Names were listed, moments recorded. One passage chilled her to her core. He brings me tonics at night now. claims they help me sleep. Yet I wake weaker each morning. I fear he means to finish what he started when he first arrived at court. That passage was dated only 5 days before Emmerich's sudden collapse, and worse. Eleonora remembered those nights. She remembered the drinks. She remembered her own hand offering them, thinking she was helping. The queen had been used, pawn in Marin's game. And now she realized the guilt she carried wasn't only about failing her husband, it was about helping his killer. That same night, a secret meeting took place in the queen's private chapel. Only 2 others were present: the kingdom's oldest historian and the man who once trained the royal scribes. She handed them the diary and whispered, "If I disappear, let truth write the next chapter." But Marin was not blind. He had spies everywhere. And he had always known that if the queen turned, everything would unravel. By dawn, Marin's wing of the palace was locked down. Guards loyal to the crown, not the queen, stood at every exit. The queen was summoned, but she did not come. Instead, a parchment was posted on the palace gates from the royal court. But signed in the queen's own hand, the king was already dead. The lies that followed must now die too. By nightfall, Marin would no longer rule in shadow. But how would the kingdom react when the mask came off, and what was left was worse than anyone imagined? The gates of the royal city trembled, not from war, but from whispers. Whispers that turned to murmurs. Murmurs that became shouts, and by dusk, the crowd was roaring. The queen's parchment had shattered the illusion Marin spent years building, no matter how many guards he posted at the palace doors. The truth had already escaped, carried by servants, scribes, and children with chalk on stone walls. The king was murdered. The throne is poisoned. The ghost of Emmerich watches. Marin tried to fight back with decrees and displays of power. He ordered the queen confined. He burned the king's journal. He accused loyal nobles of treason. But it was too late, because fear no longer worked. For the first time in years, the people stopped whispering and started marching. They gathered in silence first, not with swords, but candles. A mourning procession for the king who had died too early, and a message to the man who had taken his place. Then came the tribunes, historians, scribes, scholars, reciting the king's final entries in town squares. Someone had copied them before they were burned. The truth could not be silenced now. The rebellion didn't begin with blood. It began with remembrance. But Marin, in his panic, turned brutal. His guards opened fire on a crowd near the central gate. 5 civilians were killed. 1 was a child. And that was his final mistake. Because after that, it was no longer about justice. It became personal. Palace staff turned. Soldiers defected. The queen's loyalists reclaimed the chapel tower and rang the bell, a sound that had only ever told for the death of a monarch. It rang 3 times. Once for Emmerich, once for the truth, once for Marin. That night, Marin tried to flee the palace through the servants' tunnel. He carried gold, scrolls, and a forged seal. But when he emerged, it wasn't open fields that met him. It was silence. Torches, and a line of farmers who had waited all day, faces hard, backs straight. Behind them, the queen. She didn't speak. She didn't look away. Marin was taken not by royal guard, but by the hands of the people. His trial lasted 3 days. His crimes were read aloud in every province. And when the final verdict was handed down, it was sealed not with a royal crest, but with the handprint of the queen. Stained in ash from the king's final fire, Marin vanished. The records do not say how he died, only that his name was removed from every hall and monument. The queen ruled after, quietly, not as a ruler, but as a keeper of memory. She never remarried. She never rebuilt the wing where Emmerich died. And every year on the day of the king's death, the bell rang once, not to mourn, but to remind the kingdom, even shadows cast by kings will vanish in the light of truth.